There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around in their heads without ever having chosen it. It arrived through textbooks, through films, through the specific way veterans were welcomed home or weren't, through the particular silences in families where someone served and came back different or didn't come back at all. That version of the war tends to describe it as a tragedy of misunderstanding, a well-intentioned foreign policy that lost its way in jungle terrain and political complexity, a war that America didn't fully understand before it entered, didn't manage competently while it fought, and didn't reckon with honestly after it ended. That version is not exactly wrong, but it is constructed in a way that locates the failure in the gap between intention and execution. It suggests that if the generals had been smarter, if the politicians had been more careful, if the public had been better informed, things might have gone differently. That version is more comfortable than the truth, and it is precisely that comfort which the documents, the declassified files, the suppressed reports and the first-hand testimonies work against when they are finally examined without the filter of official explanation. The war was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented. That is a different thing entirely. Misunderstanding implies a good faith failure of knowledge or judgment. Misrepresentation implies a deliberate construction of a narrative that served institutional interests while contradicting observable reality. The people who ran the Vietnam War at its highest levels were not confused about what was happening. They were managing what was happening, which meant they were managing the story of what was happening, and those two things diverged so completely and so early that by the time the American public was being told the war was progressing well, the people saying it had documents on their desks telling them otherwise. The Pentagon Papers are the most famous example of this, but they are also, in some ways, the least interesting, because they became public and therefore became absorbed into the official narrative of the war as evidence of its mismanagement. What they actually revealed was something more corrosive. They revealed that the decision-making process at the highest levels of the American government was shaped not by assessments of what was achievable or what was true, but by what could be defended domestically and what could be maintained as a posture of credibility. The war was fought in significant part to preserve the appearance that it could be won, not because anyone with access to real information believed it could be won in any meaningful sense. That is not misunderstanding. That is a machine running on its own momentum, while the people operating it watch the gauges and say nothing. Robert McNamara knew by 1966 that the strategy wasn't working. That is not a retrospective judgment made with hindsight. It is in the documents. His own internal memos from that period describe a situation in which the military's optimistic reporting bore no relationship to conditions on the ground, in which the metrics being used to measure progress were producing false readings, and in which the continuation of the bombing campaign in the north was unlikely to achieve its stated objectives. He kept those assessments internal. He continued to appear before Congress and the public with a different set of assessments. He did this for years. When he eventually resigned in late 1967, he did not resign publicly over the war's failures. He accepted an appointment to head the World Bank. The war continued. The memos remained classified. What those memos describe, when read carefully and in sequence, is not a story of a war that was difficult to win, but a story of a war that was difficult to define. The absence of a clear definition of victory was not an oversight. It was a condition of the enterprise from the beginning. The stated objectives shifted so frequently and in response to so many different domestic and international pressures that by the mid-1960s there was no stable answer to the question of what the United States was trying to accomplish in Vietnam that would survive contact with the next policy review. Containment of communism was the broadest frame, but it was a frame that could justify almost any action and evaluate almost no outcome as a failure, because the alternative timeline in which communism spread further was always hypothetical. The military objectives changed to match the available military capacity and then changed again when that capacity proved insufficient. The political objectives changed to match the behavior of the South Vietnamese government, which was itself unstable, corrupt, and frequently at odds with the population it claimed to represent. Soldiers on the ground were operating inside this definitional vacuum in ways that shaped their experience of combat in ways that were fundamentally different from any previous American war. In World War II, territory was the metric. You took ground, held it, moved forward. Loss was measurable. Progress was geographic. In Vietnam, the military adopted the body count as its primary measure of success, and that decision corrupted the entire information system of the war in ways that took decades to fully understand. The body count was a metric designed by people who understood that territory was not a meaningful measure in a war without front lines, but who still needed a number to give to Washington. The number they chose was the number of enemy dead. That seems logical until you examine what actually happened when that number became the primary measure of performance for every unit, every commander, every officer whose career advancement depended on demonstrating results. What happened was that the number became the objective rather than a measurement of whether an objective was being achieved. Units inflated their counts. Dead civilians were counted as enemy combatants. Wounded fighters who died later were counted multiple times by different units. Animals were counted. In some documented cases, the same individuals were counted by multiple commands. Commanders who reported low body counts were questioned about their aggressiveness. Commanders who reported high body counts were promoted. The incentive structure was explicit, and it produced a reporting environment in which the numbers flowing up the chain of command had a progressively weaker relationship to conditions on the ground. By the time those numbers reached Washington and were compiled into the briefings that told officials the war was going well, they had passed through so many layers of inflation and adjustment that they were essentially fictional, and the officials receiving them, at least the ones paying close attention, knew they were essentially fictional. The system continued to produce them because the system needed them. The soldiers who were generating those numbers understood the dynamic in ways that the briefing papers did not capture. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from living inside a situation where the official version and the experienced reality are completely disconnected. Veterans who were interviewed decades later and whose accounts were suppressed or ignored when they were given in real time described a war in which the stated mission of any given operation had almost no relationship to what actually happened during that operation. You went into a village and you were supposed to be winning hearts and minds, which was the phrase used to describe the counterinsurgency strategy of building civilian support for the South Vietnamese government. And you got there, and someone had been shooting at your unit from near that village the day before, and the rules of engagement were interpreted differently by different commanders, and the distinction between a combatant and a non-combatant was functionally impossible to establish in the field under fire, and the consequence of being wrong in the permissive direction was that you were still alive, and the consequence of being wrong in the restrictive direction was that you might not be. The framework of hearts and minds dissolved almost immediately upon contact with those conditions. What replaced it was not a different framework. What replaced it was improvisation and adaptation, and the gradual erosion of the categories that soldiers had been given to organize what they were doing. The village of My Lai is the most documented instance of what that erosion could produce. On the morning of March 16, 1968, soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered the hamlet designated My Lai 4 in Quang Ngai Province. They had been told they would encounter a significant concentration of Viet Cong forces. They found instead a village of civilians, predominantly women, children, and elderly men. The men of military age were largely absent, working in the fields outside the village perimeter. Over the course of the next several hours, Charlie Company killed somewhere between 300 and 500 civilians. The exact number was disputed, as numbers from that war always were. They killed them with rifles, with grenades, in groups herded into ditches. A warrant officer named Hugh Thompson, flying reconnaissance above the village, landed his helicopter between a group of fleeing civilians and advancing American soldiers, and told his crew to open fire on the American soldiers if they advanced. He radioed the incident up his chain of command. His report was filed, and then the filing disappeared into the bureaucratic structure that processed such things, and nothing was done. The Army's investigation into My Lai, when it eventually occurred more than a year later after investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story publicly, revealed something that went beyond the massacre itself. It revealed a chain of command that had been aware of what happened, had made a series of decisions to suppress that awareness, and had then constructed a process in which individual soldiers were prosecuted, while the structural and command failures that created the conditions for the massacre were formally ignored. Lieutenant William Calley was the only person convicted. He served 3.5 years of house arrest. The officers above him, who either ordered the operation, interpreted rules of engagement in ways that permitted the killing of civilians, or suppressed the initial reports, were never charged. The investigation concluded, in language that has become one of the more quietly devastating sentences in the documentary record of the war, that the events at My Lai were not representative of the conduct of American forces in Vietnam. That conclusion was necessary because the alternative conclusion was that they were representative, and the documents that were classified and withheld in the years following My Lai suggest that the people making that determination had access to reports indicating that the systematic killing of civilians was not an isolated phenomenon. The Tiger Force was a special operations unit of the 101st Airborne Division that operated in Quang Ngai Province, the same province as My Lai, during 1967. Investigations conducted years later and reported in detail by the Toledo Blade in 2003 described a 7-month campaign in which the unit engaged in systematic atrocities that included the killing of unarmed civilians, the mutilation of bodies, the collection of ears as trophies, the destruction of villages and crops, and the killing of at least one infant. The Army investigated Tiger Force in the mid-1970s after receiving complaints from former unit members. The investigation produced 2,000 pages of documents, identified 18 soldiers as suspects, and then was closed in 1975 without any charges being filed. The documents were classified. Former members of the unit who were identified as suspects continued their careers and their lives without any legal consequence. The investigation's existence was not publicly acknowledged by the Army until the Toledo Blade began reporting on the documents in 2003, nearly 30 years after the investigation concluded. The suppression of those documents was not an accident or an oversight. It was a decision made by individuals in positions of authority who understood what the documents contained and chose to keep them from public view. The reasoning behind that decision, where it can be reconstructed from the documents that have since been released, tends to follow a consistent logic. The war was ongoing. Prosecution of American soldiers for war crimes would damage morale. It would provide propaganda to the enemy. It would undermine the South Vietnamese government's legitimacy. It would complicate negotiations. Each of these concerns was real, and each of them was used to justify suppression. The cumulative effect was a system in which accountability was structurally impossible because accountability threatened the ongoing operation of the war machine, and the ongoing operation of the war machine was treated as a value that superseded the accountability of individuals who committed acts that would, in any other context, be defined as crimes. The Phoenix program is another thread of the same fabric. It was a CIA-designed and directed program of counterinsurgency intelligence and what the official documents called neutralization of the Viet Cong infrastructure. It operated from 1968 through 1972 under the supervision of the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Organization, known as CORDS, and it was designed to identify and eliminate the civilian and political networks that supported the Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam. The program combined intelligence gathering, targeted assassination, and detention. By the program's own reported statistics, which were subject to the same inflation pressures as the body count, Phoenix neutralized more than 80,000 members of the Viet Cong infrastructure, of whom approximately 26,000 were killed. Congressional hearings on Phoenix in 1970 produced testimony from program participants and officials that described systematic torture in interrogation centers, extrajudicial execution, the killing of individuals based on intelligence that was later determined to be false or fabricated, and the use of the program by South Vietnamese officials to settle personal and political scores that had nothing to do with the communist insurgency. William Colby, who directed the program and later became Director of Central Intelligence, testified before Congress and acknowledged that abuses had occurred, but described them as deviations from program guidelines rather than expressions of program design. Former South Vietnamese Province Interrogation Center personnel described something different. They described a program in which torture was the standard method of interrogation, in which the line between neutralization meaning capture or turn and neutralization meaning kill was determined by field conditions and the preferences of South Vietnamese counterparts, and in which the paperwork system was designed to accommodate rather than prevent extrajudicial killing. The documents that have been declassified from the Phoenix program reveal a program that understood its own legal ambiguity and managed that ambiguity through classification and careful language. Reports describing the killing of individuals who were subsequently determined not to have been combatants use passive constructions and administrative terminology that obscure the physical reality of what occurred. The program's evaluation framework, which measured success by numbers of neutralizations, created the same incentive distortions as the body count. Intelligence officers who produced high neutralization numbers were evaluated positively. The quality of the intelligence underlying those numbers was harder to evaluate and therefore easier to manipulate. Informants were paid per name provided. The structure of that payment system, combined with the absence of meaningful verification procedures, produced a flow of names that included personal enemies, business rivals, and individuals whose only relationship to the Viet Cong infrastructure was that someone in their community was willing to provide their name to an American intelligence officer for compensation. The men who operated inside the Phoenix program at the operational level describe an experience of progressive moral detachment that runs through their accounts with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss as coincidental. They describe arriving in Vietnam with a framework for what they were doing that involved intelligence gathering and targeted operations against genuine insurgent networks, and then encountering conditions in which that framework progressively dissolved. The intelligence was unreliable. The South Vietnamese counterparts had objectives that diverged from the program's stated objectives. The pressure to produce numbers was constant. The mechanisms for questioning the quality of the numbers or the legality of specific operations were either absent or hostile to use. The adaptation that resulted was not a conscious moral choice in most cases. It was the incremental adjustment to an environment in which the original framework no longer matched the operational reality, and in which the alternative to adjustment was removal from a program that would continue without you. The war absorbed individuals through a process that left most of them with no single moment at which they could identify having made a decision they knew was wrong, only a progressive distance from the person they had been before they arrived. The use of chemical agents in Vietnam is another area where the gap between official representation and documented reality requires specific attention. Agent Orange, the herbicide mixture used in Operation Ranch Hand to defoliate jungle terrain and destroy food crops, was applied to approximately 20% of South Vietnam's land area between 1961 and 1971. The military's stated objective was to eliminate jungle cover used by the Viet Cong and to deny food supplies to enemy forces. The herbicide contained dioxin as a contaminant, specifically the compound 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-paradioxin, which is one of the most toxic compounds ever synthesized and which is classified as a known human carcinogen. The internal documents of Dow Chemical and Monsanto, the primary manufacturers of Agent Orange, show that both companies were aware of the health risks associated with dioxin contamination as early as the 1950s, before the large-scale application in Vietnam began. Studies conducted by the manufacturers on factory workers exposed to dioxin during the production process showed elevated rates of a condition called chlorachin and suggested potential systemic toxicity. Those studies were not shared with the military and were not disclosed publicly. The Department of Defense contracted for herbicide production without conducting independent health assessments of the compounds being purchased, and the military's internal assessments of Agent Orange's safety, which were produced in the 1960s, were optimistic in ways that subsequent evidence does not support. The veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange, both American and Vietnamese, began reporting elevated rates of cancer, neurological disorders, and reproductive effects within years of the war's end. The Department of Veterans Affairs resisted connecting those health outcomes to Agent Orange exposure for decades, citing scientific uncertainty and the difficulty of establishing causal relationships. The VA's posture on Agent Orange was shaped in part by the financial implications of acknowledging causation, since recognition of Agent Orange as a cause of specific conditions would trigger compensation claims from hundreds of thousands of veterans. Internal VA documents from the 1980s show that the agency's scientific and legal staff were aware of studies showing health impacts that exceeded what the agency was publicly acknowledging, and that the agency's public communications were calibrated to manage the financial exposure of the government rather than to provide veterans with the most accurate available information about their health risks. For Vietnamese civilians and veterans, the situation was categorically worse. The Vietnamese government has estimated that approximately 3 million Vietnamese people have been affected by Agent Orange, including second- and third-generation offspring born with severe birth defects attributed to dioxin exposure. The United States government has provided compensation and medical assistance to American veterans affected by Agent Orange through a legislative process that took decades and required sustained political pressure from veterans organizations. It has provided negligible direct assistance to Vietnamese victims of the same exposures. The asymmetry is not simply a matter of legal jurisdiction or diplomatic complexity. It reflects a continuing refusal to fully account for the scale and character of the harm caused by the chemical warfare program in Vietnam. Because full accounting would require acknowledging decisions made by identifiable individuals in the American government and the American chemical industry that produced foreseeable harm to millions of people. The air war over North Vietnam and Laos is another area where the official record and the documented reality diverge in ways that were not accidental. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that ran from 1965 through 1968, was presented publicly as a program of strategic interdiction designed to degrade North Vietnam's military capacity and will to continue supporting the southern insurgency. The internal assessments of the bombing program, including extensive analysis conducted by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and McNamara's own Systems Analysis Office, consistently found that the bombing was not achieving its stated objectives. North Vietnam's logistical capacity continued to function despite the bombing. Its will to continue the war was not diminished. The costs being inflicted on North Vietnamese civilians, including substantial casualties among the civilian population of bombed areas, were generating international criticism that complicated American diplomatic positioning. Those assessments were produced, classified, and filed while the bombing continued. Johnson administration officials publicly described Rolling Thunder as effective. The disconnect between the internal assessments and the public statements was not a matter of officials believing the optimistic public version, while the pessimistic internal version was a minority view. The pessimistic internal version was the consensus view of the intelligence community and the systems analysts. The public version was a different product, designed for a different purpose. The bombing of Laos, which ran concurrently with Rolling Thunder and continued long after Rolling Thunder was halted, occupies an even more specific space in the category of what was hidden from public view. Between 1964 and 1973, The United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. For the first several years of the bombing campaign, its existence was classified. Congress appropriated funds for it under cover designations. The Laotian government was nominally neutral under the terms of the Geneva Accords of 1962, which explicitly prohibited foreign military operations in Laotian territory. The bombing was a systematic violation of those accords, conducted over years in secret, while the United States government officially affirmed its commitment to Laotian neutrality. The CIA's operations in Laos, which included the recruitment and command of the Hmong guerrilla army known as the Secret Army or Armée Clandestine, were similarly concealed. At its peak, the CIA was directing military operations involving tens of thousands of fighters on foreign soil without congressional authorization, without public knowledge, and with casualty rates among the Hmong population that were catastrophic. The Hmong had been recruited with promises of American support and protection. When the war ended, those promises were not honored. The Hmong, who could not reach evacuation points, were left to the political consequences of having fought on the American side, which in practical terms meant persecution, imprisonment, and death for many thousands of people. The Americans who had recruited them and directed their military operations had left. The documents describing the program's commitments to the Hmong remained classified. The program's architects moved on to other assignments. The treatment of American prisoners of war in North Vietnam is a subject on which the government's public communications and its private assessments diverged in specific and documented ways. During the war, the existence of an organized torture program at Hoa Lo prison and other facilities holding American POWs was known to the government through returned prisoners, through intelligence, and through the accounts of prisoners who were released early for propaganda purposes and who provided detailed testimony. The government's public posture was to minimize acknowledgement of torture because acknowledging it would require response, would complicate negotiations, and would generate domestic political pressure for actions that the administration was not prepared to take. Returned prisoners who provided detailed testimony about torture were in some cases told to moderate their public statements. The Navy and Air Force conducted debriefings of returned prisoners that produced extensive documentation of torture, systematic maltreatment, and in some cases, behavior by prisoners under extreme duress that the services were reluctant to expose publicly. The code of conduct under which American military personnel were required to resist providing information to captors had been written without accounting for the possibility of systematic torture as a standard interrogation method. When that torture was documented in detail, the military faced the problem of how to evaluate the conduct of prisoners who had provided information or made statements under conditions of severe physical coercion. The solution, in most cases, was administrative management of the documentation rather than formal proceedings, because formal proceedings would have required publicly establishing the torture record in detail, and that record was more complicated than the narrative of heroic resistance that served better purposes. The question of missing in action personnel, which became one of the most politically charged issues of the post-war period, also has a documentary dimension that the government's public position did not fully reflect. The Nixon administration's negotiations with North Vietnam over the return of prisoners and the accounting of missing personnel produced private assessments by American negotiators that differed from the public statements about the comprehensiveness of Vietnamese accounting. Internal State Department and National Security Council documents from the negotiation period show American officials aware that the Vietnamese accounting of missing Americans was incomplete, aware that some portion of those missing might be held after the formal prisoner release, and choosing to accept the accounting that had been produced because the alternative was to acknowledge publicly that the agreement that ended American involvement in the war had not secured the return of all American personnel. That acknowledgement would have been politically devastating for an administration that had premised the Paris Peace Accords as a successful conclusion to American involvement. The Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, chaired by Senator John Kerry and Senator Bob Smith in 1991 and 1992, conducted the most extensive official investigation of the POW and MIA issue. Its final report, which runs to over 1,300 pages, concluded that the evidence did not support a finding that live American prisoners were held in Vietnam after the war ended. But it also documented extensive instances in which intelligence reports suggesting possible live prisoner sightings had been improperly handled, classified, or discounted by the Defense Intelligence Agency. The committee's investigators found that the DIA's analytical unit responsible for POW and MIA analysis had an institutional bias toward discounting rather than pursuing intelligence that suggested live prisoners, and that this bias was reinforced by the resource implications of taking such intelligence seriously, since a serious pursuit of live prisoner intelligence would generate political and resource demands that the institution preferred to avoid. The defoliation of Vietnamese agricultural land was not limited to the application of Agent Orange. The military also engaged in extensive crop destruction operations using other herbicides and using mechanical means designed to deny food to the Viet Cong and to create population movement from rural areas into government-controlled urban centers. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which was the South Vietnamese government's primary counterinsurgency program for separating the rural population from the insurgency in the early 1960s, involved the forcible relocation of rural Vietnamese from their ancestral villages into fortified settlements under government control. The program was evaluated internally by American advisors as largely counterproductive, since the forced relocations generated hostility toward the government and toward the American presence that it was supposedly trying to prevent. Those evaluations were produced, classified, and filed while the program continued. The internal evaluations of the Strategic Hamlet program are notable not only for their pessimism about the program's effectiveness, but for the frankness with which American advisors described the South Vietnamese government's relationship with its own population. The government of Ngo Dinh Diem, which the United States had supported, engineered, and in significant ways created through its involvement in South Vietnamese politics after the Geneva Accords of 1954, was described in internal American assessments as repressive, corrupt, out of touch with rural Vietnamese, and sustained primarily by American support rather than by any organic popular legitimacy. Those assessments were being produced throughout the period when American officials were publicly describing Diem as the indispensable leader of a free Vietnam and the essential counterpart to American efforts to prevent communist takeover. When Diem was overthrown and killed in a military coup in November of 1963, 3 weeks before Kennedy's assassination, the coup was conducted with American foreknowledge and, at minimum, American acquiescence. The internal documents show that American officials had signaled to the coup plotters that the United States would not oppose the coup, which was a meaningful signal in an environment where American support was the primary source of the South Vietnamese military's resources and political legitimacy. The cable traffic from that period shows officials in Washington aware that a coup was imminent, debating how actively to encourage it, and ultimately concluding that the United States would step back and allow events to proceed. Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Hu, were killed during or after their capture. The American officials who had communicated American non-opposition to the coup were not responsible for those deaths in any direct or legal sense, but the documents establish a chain of awareness and decision that is more complicated than the public account of the coup as a purely Vietnamese internal event. The succession of governments that followed the Diem coup in rapid sequence, each of them unstable, each of them sustained by American support, each of them evaluated in internal American assessments as lacking the political legitimacy necessary to prosecute a successful counterinsurgency, forms a pattern that runs through the entire American involvement in Vietnam. The United States was fighting a war whose political premise was the existence of a South Vietnamese government with sufficient legitimacy and capacity to survive without direct American combat support. The internal assessments consistently found that no such government existed or was likely to exist in the foreseeable future. The external posture consistently affirmed that such a government was developing and that American support was contributing to its development. The gap between those two positions was never resolved. It was managed through continued investment in the premise and continued suppression of the assessments that contradicted it. The use of napalm in Vietnam was known during the war, but its full scale and the specific conditions of its application were not well understood by the American public. Napalm B, the formulation used in Vietnam, adhered to surfaces and burned at extremely high temperatures, making it effective at destroying jungle cover and structures, but also producing severe burn casualties among anyone in its area of application. The military's rules of engagement regarding napalm included restrictions on its use near civilian populations, but the enforcement of those restrictions in field conditions was inconsistent, and the records of specific strikes were often incomplete or classified. The photographs that came to symbolize the napalm dimension of the war, including the image taken by Nick Utt of 9-year-old Kim Phuc running from a napalm strike in June of 1972, were instances where the reality of the war's conduct toward civilians broke through the classification and information management systems that usually prevented such images from reaching public distribution. The Associated Press initially decided not to distribute the UT photograph because of its graphic nature, a decision that was overridden, and the photograph went on to become one of the defining images of the 20th century. What the photograph captured was an event that was in a certain sense typical, in that napalm strikes near civilian areas were a regular occurrence in Vietnam. The atypical element was the presence of a photographer and the subsequent survival of the photograph through a distribution system that usually filtered such images before they reached American newspapers. The Army's own studies of napalm casualties, which were classified and which have been partially declassified in subsequent decades, show rates of civilian burn casualties that are inconsistent with the rules of engagement as publicly described. Those studies were produced by Army medical personnel and logisticians who needed accurate casualty data for supply planning and medical preparation purposes, and their operational requirements meant that the data they produced was more accurate than the data that appeared in public military briefings. The gap between those internal studies and the public statements about the precision and discrimination of American air operations is another instance of the same pattern that runs through virtually every area of the Vietnam documentary record. The fragging phenomenon, in which enlisted soldiers attacked or killed their own officers using fragmentation grenades, is documented in military criminal records, but the scale of the phenomenon and its significance as an indicator of morale and command authority breakdown were not publicly acknowledged during the war with anything approaching accuracy. The Army's own criminal investigation records document hundreds of fragging incidents in Vietnam, concentrated in the period from 1969 through 1971, when morale in ground combat units had deteriorated most severely. The actual number of fragging incidents was higher than the criminal records reflect, since many incidents were reported as accidents, resolved informally at unit level, or simply not reported at all. The conditions that produced fragging were the conditions that American policy had created and then failed to address. Soldiers were serving in a war whose stated objectives had become incoherent, in units whose rotation system meant that experienced personnel were continuously cycling out and being replaced by new arrivals, under commanders whose career incentives sometimes diverged sharply from their soldiers' survival interests. In an environment where the enemy was indistinguishable from the civilian population, and where the definition of a successful operation was the production of a body count number, rather than the achievement of any geographic or political objective. The adaptive response to those conditions included drug use, which by the early 1970s had reached rates in some units that the Army's own medical surveys described as approaching a majority of personnel, and included the informal abandonment of aggressive patrolling and combat operations in favor of the appearance of operations without the substance. The term combat refusal, which described units or individuals who refused orders to conduct combat operations, appears with increasing frequency in Army records from 1969 onward. The incidents were handled at unit level in most cases, with formal charges being rare because formal charges required formal proceedings, and formal proceedings required documentation that would become part of a record. The Army's preference was to manage the problem administratively and informally, transferring personnel, adjusting assignments, and accepting a degraded operational tempo, rather than confronting the institutional implications of widespread combat refusal by soldiers who had concluded that the operations they were being ordered to conduct had no meaningful purpose. The intelligence failures that contributed to the Tet Offensive in January of 1968 represent another specific area where the gap between what officials knew and what officials said is documented in detail. The Tet Offensive was the coordinated attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces on more than 100 South Vietnamese towns and cities, including the assault on the American embassy in Saigon. It was presented publicly as a surprise attack, and in operational terms it was a surprise in the sense that the scale and coordination of the attacks were not anticipated by American and South Vietnamese intelligence. But the intelligence record shows something more complicated. American intelligence had detected significant movement of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in the weeks before Tet. The indicators that something large was being planned were visible in communications intercepts, in prisoner interrogations, and in the pattern of enemy activity. The failure was not an absence of indicators, but an interpretive failure, shaped by the institutional investment in the narrative of American progress in the war. The previous 2 years of briefings had described the war as going well, had described enemy forces as degraded and demoralized, had described the body count as evidence of cumulative attrition that was reducing the enemy's capacity to operate. An intelligence assessment that predicted a massive coordinated offensive would have required reconciling those indicators with a narrative of enemy weakness that the entire intelligence and operational briefing system had been producing. That reconciliation did not occur because the narrative had its own momentum and its own institutional support, and the specific indicators pointing toward Tet were not sufficiently strong to overcome that momentum before the offensive began. The political impact of Tet in the United States was precisely the impact that the American officials had been most anxious to avoid. The images of North Vietnamese sappers in the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon, televised in real time, made the preceding years of official optimism suddenly visible as what it had been. Walter Cronkite's editorial after his return from Vietnam, in which he concluded that the war was mired in stalemate, represented a shift in the media environment that Johnson found politically devastating. What is less well understood is that the Tet Offensive was, in military terms, a significant defeat for the attacking forces. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties. The popular uprising they had hoped to trigger in South Vietnamese cities did not materialize. The gains they made were not held. In purely military terms, Tet was an American victory. The internal military assessment said so. The public perception was the opposite, and that public perception was not simply a media distortion. It was the delayed recognition of what had been hidden, arriving through a single set of images, carrying with it the accumulated weight of years of suppressed information. The My Lai massacre occurred 6 weeks after Tet. Charlie Company had been through months of operations in Quang Ngai province, had sustained casualties from mines and booby traps without making direct contact with enemy forces in significant numbers, had lost personnel to the grinding pressure of an enemy that was present in the population and the terrain without being visible in the ways that training had prepared them to deal with. The briefing before the My Lai operation told them they would find main force Viet Cong. They found instead the village that they then spent the morning destroying. The relationship between those two facts, between the specific conditions of that unit in that moment and the outcome of that morning, is not a relationship that explains away the killing. It is a relationship that explains how the conditions the military had created produced outcomes that the military then needed to classify and deny. The medical consequences of service in Vietnam extended beyond Agent Orange exposure in ways that the Veterans Administration was slow to acknowledge and slower to fund. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which was not formally recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, when it was included in the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was present in Vietnam, veterans in numbers that the VA's treatment capacity was not prepared to address and that its institutional culture was not prepared to acknowledge. The term that had been used previously, combat stress or shell shock or combat fatigue, was used in ways that implied temporariness, that the condition would resolve with rest and time and distance from combat. The clinical reality, as it accumulated through the 1970s in the work of psychiatrists treating Vietnam veterans outside the VA system, was that a significant portion of veterans were experiencing persistent, severe psychological consequences from their service that were not resolving. The VA's response to this accumulating clinical evidence was shaped by the same institutional logic that had shaped the Pentagon's response to the internal intelligence assessments during the war. Acknowledging the scale of the problem would have required resources, would have required changing institutional practices, and would have required a public accounting of what the war had done to the people who fought it that conflicted with the institutional interest in managing the story of the war's legacy. The documentation from inside the VA in the 1970s shows an institution aware that the problem was larger than its official position acknowledged, managing that awareness through administrative categorization and resource limitation, rather than confronting it programmatically. The scale of American deaths in Vietnam, 58,220, is the most frequently cited American casualty figure from the war. The figure is accurate in the specific and limited sense that it counts American personnel who died in theater or who were evacuated and died of wounds received in Vietnam. It does not count the veterans who died in subsequent years and decades from service-connected illnesses, from Agent Orange-related cancers, from untreated psychological consequences of combat exposure that manifested as alcohol and drug dependence, from suicide. The epidemiological literature on Vietnam veterans in the years following the war shows elevated mortality rates from multiple causes that are not captured in the war's official casualty figures. The VA's own studies of veteran populations in the decades after the war show patterns that are difficult to attribute to anything other than the war's physiological and psychological effects. Those patterns are not compiled into a single official figure that would more accurately represent the human cost of the American involvement. For Vietnamese people, the accounting is even more incomplete. The Vietnamese government's official estimate of military and civilian deaths attributable to the war is approximately 3 million people. But that figure is an estimate produced decades after events for which systematic record-keeping was itself a casualty of the conflict. The true number of Vietnamese deaths is unknown and unknowable with precision. What is known, from the specific records that do exist, and from the physical evidence of bomb damage assessments and population surveys, is that the war killed Vietnamese people in numbers that dwarf the American casualties by an order of magnitude, and that a significant portion of the Vietnamese dead were civilians who had no meaningful military role in the conflict, and whose deaths were the consequence of operations whose official justification was the protection of the South Vietnamese civilian population. The Phoenix program's targeting intelligence, as previously noted, was unreliable in specific ways that meant that a proportion of the people it neutralized were not members of any insurgent infrastructure. The Air War's targeting intelligence was unreliable in analogous ways. The systems for identifying valid military targets in a war without front lines and with an enemy embedded in the civilian population were imperfect, and the imperfections were documented internally. The percentage of airstrike targets in Vietnam that produced no assessed military damage, meaning no enemy personnel, vehicles, or facilities, was substantial. Those strikes were not strikes against enemy combatants who happened to be near civilians. They were strikes against areas assessed as enemy-controlled or enemy-used that contained, in some cases, primarily civilian populations who had nowhere to go because the war had surrounded them. The internal damage assessment reports for those strikes used language and categories that minimized civilian casualty visibility, because accurate civilian casualty reporting would have conflicted with the rules of engagement and with the public descriptions of American targeting precision. The South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was the force that American strategy ultimately depended on to fight and win the war. The entire Vietnamization policy of the Nixon administration, which was the strategy of progressively withdrawing American forces while building up the South Vietnamese military to take over combat operations, rested on an assessment of the ARVN's capacity and willingness to fight effectively against North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The internal assessments of the ARVN throughout the war were consistently and significantly more pessimistic than the public statements about Vietnamization. American advisors with the ARVN documented desertion rates, logistical failures, command corruption, and operational ineffectiveness in detail. Those documents were classified, and their pessimistic conclusions were not reflected in the public presentations of Vietnamization's progress. The Easter Offensive of 1972, in which North Vietnamese regular army forces crossed the DMZ in a conventional military assault, tested the ARVN's capacity without direct American ground combat support for the first time at scale. The ARVN's performance was mixed and was in several areas consistent with the pessimistic internal assessments that had been suppressed during the public rollout of Vietnamization. Several South Vietnamese divisions collapsed under the North Vietnamese assault. The defense of the country during the Easter Offensive depended heavily on American air power, which was massively applied in response to the attack, and on American advisors and logistical support. The military analysis conducted after the Easter Offensive acknowledged in classified documents that the ARVN had not yet developed the capacity to defeat a major North Vietnamese conventional assault without substantial American support. That conclusion was not reflected in the public statements about Vietnamization's success that continued to be made through the Paris Peace Accords negotiations. Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia, which began in March of 1969 and which was called Operation Menu, involved the deliberate falsification of official records. The bombing was designed to target North Vietnamese logistics bases in eastern Cambodia and was conducted in secret from Congress and the American public because Cambodia was a neutral country and bombing it without a declaration of war or congressional authorization was, at minimum, legally problematic. The method used to keep the bombing secret from official records involved a dual reporting system in which the actual targets in Cambodia were reported as being in South Vietnam. Air Force personnel who participated in the dual reporting system were required to falsify their own operational reports. The official flight records for the bombers involved showed South Vietnamese target coordinates when the actual missions had been flown to Cambodian coordinates. This was not informal sloppiness. It was a systematic, institutionally organized falsification of official military records conducted at the direction of the National Security Council and with the knowledge of the Secretary of Defense. When the bombing became public in 1969 through a New York Times report based on sources within the military who were troubled by the falsification, the Nixon administration's response included an FBI investigation to identify the leakers, conducted through wiretaps on the phones of journalists and National Security Council staff. The wiretaps were conducted without judicial authorization. The falsification of the Air Force records was never prosecuted. The individuals who leaked the information about the bombing to the press were pursued through the national security apparatus. The sequence of those two responses tells a specific story about institutional priorities. The peace negotiations that produced the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were conducted against a background of internal assessments that were pessimistic about the agreement's durability. American negotiators, intelligence analysts, and diplomatic staff produced analyses indicating that North Vietnam had not abandoned its objective of reunifying Vietnam under its control, that the terms of the agreement would not be enforced by any mechanism with sufficient credibility to deter North Vietnamese violations, and that the South Vietnamese government's political and military situation was not sufficiently stable to survive without continued substantial American support. Those analyses were correct. The agreement held for roughly 2 years, in the sense that the formal structure of two Vietnamese states, separated by a ceasefire line, persisted on paper. The North Vietnamese continued to build up their forces and logistical infrastructure in the South. Congress cut military assistance to South Vietnam. The ARVN's capacity degraded as equipment wore out and ammunition stocks diminished. In April 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a conventional military offensive that resulted in the collapse of the South Vietnamese government in 55 days. The evacuation of Saigon on April 29th and 30th of 1975 is documented in detail in American records and in the accounts of the people who were present. The images of helicopters lifting off from the embassy roof, of the crowds of Vietnamese civilians pressing against the embassy gates, of the carriers offshore receiving evacuees and then pushing helicopters into the ocean to make room for more, record the physical reality of the war's end for the American presence in Vietnam. The South Vietnamese, who had worked most closely with the American government, the intelligence officers, the military officers, the administrators who had committed themselves to the American presence because the American presence had asked them to commit themselves, were left in numbers that are impossible to specify, precisely because the evacuation records are incomplete and because many of the people who were left did not survive the subsequent political restructuring of the country in ways that produced documentary records. The promises made to those individuals, the implicit and in some cases explicit assurances that the American commitment to South Vietnam was durable and that their identification with the American enterprise would not be allowed to result in their abandonment, are visible in the documents of the period in the same way that the promises to the Hmong are visible. They were made. They were sincere in the sense that the individuals making them intended them as sincere, and they were not kept because the conditions that would have allowed them to be kept were not maintained. The people who made those promises were not present at the embassy on the last days of April 1975. They had moved on to other assignments, other roles, other wars. The debate within the American military about what lessons to draw from Vietnam began almost before the war ended and continued through decades of doctrinal development. The lesson that came to dominate American military thinking by the time of the 1991 Gulf War was the lesson of overwhelming force and clear objectives, the idea that Vietnam had failed because the military had been constrained by political interference from applying sufficient force to achieve decisive military results. That lesson, which became known as the Powell Doctrine, located the failure of Vietnam in the management of military force rather than in the political premises of the enterprise. It was a lesson that protected the institutional interests of the military because it defined the failure as a product of civilian political constraints rather than military strategy. It was also a lesson that did not require confronting the body count, the Phoenix program, My Lai, Tiger Force, the fragging, the drug use, the combat refusals, the falsification of records, or the systematic suppression of accurate reporting. Those elements of the Vietnam experience were not incorporated into the lesson that the military drew. They were not classified exactly, but they were not taught. They were present in the archives and absent from the doctrine. The soldiers who came back from Vietnam and tried to tell what they had seen and done encountered an institutional structure that was not prepared to receive that information honestly. The Winter Soldier investigation, held in Detroit in January and February of 1971 under the Organization of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, brought together more than 100 veterans who testified in detail about war crimes they had witnessed or participated in. The testimony was specific, named, and in many cases corroborated by multiple witnesses. It described the killing of prisoners, the killing of civilians, the use of prohibited weapons, the destruction of villages, the systematic disregard for the laws of war in operations against civilian populations. The Pentagon's response was to attempt to discredit the witnesses, to question whether they had actually served in the capacities they claimed, and to avoid engaging with the substance of the testimony. Some of the witnesses were subsequently investigated for potential criminal charges related to their own participation in the events they described. None of the command-level individuals responsible for the policy context in which those events occurred were investigated. John Kerry's testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in April of 1971 drew on the Winter Soldier testimony and described the war in terms that were drawn directly from the veterans who had testified. The response from the White House and from veterans organizations that supported the war was to attack Kerry's credibility and his motives. The substance of what he described, based on the testimony of combat veterans who had been there, was not addressed. The administrative and institutional mechanisms for addressing it did not exist in a form that would have produced accountability, because the investigation of command-level responsibility for the conditions that produced the events described would have implicated people still in positions of authority. The missing history of Vietnam is not missing because the documents were destroyed, although some were. It is missing in the sense that the official historical record and the institutional memory of the war were constructed in ways that preserved the narrative of mismanagement at the cost of obscuring the narrative of systematic misrepresentation. The difference matters because mismanagement is correctable. You hire better managers, develop better doctrine, improve your systems. Systematic misrepresentation, if it is confronted, requires acknowledging that the institutions involved produced false information deliberately, and that the people who consumed that information and acted on it were responsible for understanding the difference. That acknowledgement was not made. The people who ran the Vietnam War were not prosecuted. They wrote books and gave interviews and were eulogized when they died as public servants who had faced difficult circumstances. The soldiers who fragged their officers, who refused orders, who gave testimony at Winter Soldier, who leaked documents, who told what they saw, faced investigation, prosecution, silence, or the particular kind of dismissal that comes when what you are saying is too complicated for the available institutional vocabulary. The tunnels of Cu Chi, which formed a network of underground passages used by Viet Cong forces throughout the Iron Triangle region near Saigon, were known to the American military from early in the war. The military's efforts to find, map, and destroy the tunnels involved the use of tunnel rats, soldiers who entered the tunnels alone or in small groups with a flashlight and a pistol to find and engage enemy forces underground. The tunnel rat experience is documented in accounts that describe conditions of total sensory disorientation, extreme physical confinement, and the absolute impossibility of distinguishing between what was expected and what was actually encountered underground in the dark. Soldiers who served as tunnel rats describe an experience that stripped away every framework for processing the environment and required improvisation under conditions where improvisation was the only available mode of operation. The tunnels were never fully destroyed. They extended under areas that American forces operated in for years, allowing enemy forces to move and cache supplies in ways that made the American surface control of the terrain above essentially symbolic. The Ia Drang Valley Campaign of November 1965, the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular army forces, established several patterns that would define the next decade of the war. The battle, which involved the 1st Cavalry Division and North Vietnamese forces at Landing Zone X-Ray and Landing Zone Albany, produced significant American casualties and was presented publicly as an American victory because American forces had inflicted higher casualties on the North Vietnamese than they had suffered. The internal military analysis of the battle was more complicated. It showed that the North Vietnamese regular army was capable of fighting the American military effectively in sustained engagements, that the mobility provided by helicopters was crucial but not decisive, and that the body count metric was already producing analytical distortions because the North Vietnamese willingness to sustain casualties in pursuit of their objectives made casualty ratios a poor indicator of strategic progress. Those analytical conclusions were noted in the classified assessments of the battle and were not reflected in the public account of a successful American military debut. The specific experience of African American soldiers in Vietnam is another dimension of the war's history that the official record captured incompletely. Black soldiers were drafted and killed in numbers disproportionate to their representation in the American population, particularly in the early years of the war before protest movements and legal challenges altered the draft deferment system. The military's internal equal opportunity reporting from Vietnam documented racial tensions in units, racial discrimination in assignment practices, and racially motivated violence between American soldiers. But the scale of those tensions and the institutional practices that produced them were not reflected in public military communications about the integrated armed forces that Vietnam was supposedly demonstrating. The racial dynamic of the war, in which Black Americans were dying in disproportionate numbers in a war for the freedom of a foreign country, while their communities in the United States were engaged in a civil rights struggle against institutionalized discrimination, was one that produced political contradictions that the military's public communications were not designed to address. Martin Luther King's statement in 1967, in which he described the war as requiring young Black men to fight for a freedom that they had not been given at home, was the kind of statement that could not be addressed through the normal processes of information management. It was a statement that the factual record of the war's demographic composition made difficult to rebut. The FBI's investigation of King included, as one of its concerns, his opposition to the Vietnam War, which the Bureau regarded as having foreign-influenced dimensions, the surveillance of anti-war veterans, the Winter Soldier participants, and veterans organizations that opposed the war was extensive, and is documented in COINTELPRO files that were later partially released. The apparatus of state surveillance that was applied to people who were describing the war accurately was not an incidental feature of the period. It was an active mechanism for suppressing information. The psychological operations conducted by American forces in Vietnam and the psychological operations conducted by the American government on the American public share a common logic that is visible in the documents from the period. Both involved the deliberate construction of messages designed to produce behavioral and attitudinal outcomes, and both involved the management of information to support those messages. The distinction between information that was classified to protect operational security and information that was classified to protect the narrative of the war's progress is a distinction that is visible in retrospect from the pattern of what was classified and what was not, and the pattern does not reflect primarily operational security concerns. The operational details that would have assisted an enemy were not the primary content of the most sensitive classified assessments. The primary content of those assessments was the gap between the official narrative and the measured reality. The journalists who tried to report that gap during the war worked in an environment where access to information was controlled by the military and where the professional and social consequences of reporting against the official narrative were significant. David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, whose early reporting from Vietnam in the early 1960s described conditions that contradicted the official optimism, were subjected to pressure from the Kennedy administration that included attempts to have them reassigned or removed from Vietnam by their news organizations. The reporting was accurate. The pressure was a response to its accuracy, not to any factual errors. The pattern in which accurate reporting was treated as a problem to be managed rather than information to be incorporated was consistent throughout the war. The Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg leaked to the New York Times and the Washington Post in 1971, represented the most significant single release of classified documentation about the war during the war. The Nixon administration's attempt to prevent their publication through a prior restraint order was rejected by the Supreme Court in New York Times Company versus United States, in a ruling that established important press freedom precedent. The papers themselves revealed the systematic misrepresentation of the war's prospects across multiple administrations and confirmed much of what the anti-war movement had been saying for years. The public impact of the papers was significant, but was also contained in ways that are worth noting. They were absorbed into the existing framework of Vietnam narrative, described as evidence of government deception without producing the kind of systematic accountability for that deception that the content of the documents would have suggested was warranted. The officials named in the documents as having produced the false assessments were not prosecuted for producing them. The classification system that had kept them secret was not fundamentally reformed. The next generation of similar decisions was made by the same institutions, using the same processes. Ellsberg was prosecuted under the Espionage Act for leaking the Pentagon Papers. The charges were dismissed in 1973 because of prosecutorial misconduct that included evidence obtained through illegal wiretapping and the break-in of Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office by operatives connected to the Nixon White House. The dismissal was on procedural grounds, not on the grounds that the information Ellsberg had released was in the public interest, or that its classification had been improper. The legal framework that governed the publication of classified information remained unchanged. The government retained the authority to classify information and to prosecute those who disclosed it, and the pattern of classification being used to suppress information that was politically inconvenient rather than operationally sensitive was not addressed by any mechanism that would have altered it going forward. The specific files and reports that remain classified from the Vietnam War period are not publicly known in their totality because the classification system does not require disclosure of what is classified. The National Archives holds millions of pages of Vietnam-era documents in various states of classification. Declassification reviews have been conducted in waves over the decades and have released substantial quantities of material, but the process is reactive rather than systematic. Documents are reviewed for declassification when someone requests them or when they fall under automatic declassification timelines. The most sensitive assessments and the most specific documentation of command-level awareness of atrocities and policy failures are among the documents that have been most consistently withheld from automatic declassification review, or that have been released in heavily redacted form. The intelligence community's assessment files from Vietnam, particularly the CIA's Office of National Estimates products from the middle period of the war, contain material that would, if fully released and read in sequence, provide a detailed record of what the intelligence community told the political leadership about the war's trajectory and how those assessments were managed, rather than incorporated into policy. Partial releases from these files, obtained through Freedom of Information Act litigation over decades, show assessments that were significantly more pessimistic than the contemporaneous public statements of the officials who received them. The full record has not been released. The agencies involved continue to apply national security exemptions to specific portions of the record, decades after the events, in circumstances where the operational security rationale for continued classification is difficult to sustain on its merits. The treatment of veterans who came back from Vietnam and sought to speak publicly about what they had experienced reflects the same dynamic in a different register. The mechanisms for dismissing, discrediting, or absorbing their accounts were sophisticated and consistent. The most common was to treat the accounts as evidence of individual psychological damage rather than of factual conditions, which had the effect of converting accurate description into symptom and relocating the significance of the account from the external world to the internal state of the individual providing it. A veteran who described witnessing or participating in actions that violated the laws of war was more easily processed as a traumatized individual than as a witness to institutional conduct that required institutional accountability. The psychological damage was real. Its use as a frame for dismissing factual claims is what requires notice. The VA's treatment framework for Vietnam veterans with post-traumatic stress reinforced this dynamic in ways that were probably not fully intentional, but were consistent with institutional interests. The therapeutic model focused on processing the veteran's psychological response to their experience, which was appropriate clinical work. It did not, in most cases, include any mechanism for transmitting what the veteran had witnessed to any accountability process. The experience was treated as private psychological history rather than as potential evidence of institutional conduct. The therapeutic relationship and its confidentiality served veterans' individual healing. And the same confidentiality served to contain within the therapeutic relationship information about the war's conduct that might otherwise have generated broader scrutiny. The wars that followed Vietnam were shaped by the lessons drawn from it, but not primarily by the lessons that the classified record would suggest are most important. The lesson drawn by the military was largely the Powell Doctrine lesson of clear objectives, overwhelming force, and defined exit conditions. The lesson that would have been suggested by the systematic misrepresentation, the corrupted metrics, the suppression of accountability, the psychological damage, the civilian casualties, and the ultimate futility of the enterprise would have been a more fundamental lesson about the conditions under which military force can achieve stated political objectives and the institutional mechanisms that produce false readings of those conditions. That lesson was not institutionalized because institutionalizing it would have required confronting the specific decisions and the specific people who made them, and that confrontation was managed into irrelevance by the same processes that had managed the war itself. The soldiers who served in Vietnam and came back and carried what they carried did so largely without the kind of institutional support that would have required acknowledging what they had been put through and what they had been asked to do. The VA system that was supposed to serve them was shaped by the same institutional interests that had shaped the conduct of the war, in the sense that accurate accounting of the war's human cost to those who fought it would have generated claims and obligations that the institution preferred to manage rather than meet. The adjustment of diagnostic criteria, the restriction of coverage, the bureaucratic obstacles to claims, the specific ways in which the institution processed applications from veterans asserting service connection for conditions that the evidence suggested were service-connected, formed a system that filtered out as much of the cost as it could absorb without politically untenable pressure. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that the American military fought for a decade were fighting a war with different objectives and different metrics. For them, the relevant measure of progress was not body count or territory held, but the continued existence of their political and military capacity to prosecute the war indefinitely. They calculated correctly, as it turned out, that the American domestic political system would not sustain an indefinite war commitment against an adversary who was willing to absorb casualties at rates that the American public and the American political system found unacceptable. Their strategy was not to win in any conventional military sense. It was to not lose until the American will to continue dissipated. The American military's adaptation to fight that strategy was insufficient because the adaptation required acknowledging what the strategy was and acknowledging what the strategy was required, acknowledging that the metrics being used to measure progress were measuring the wrong things. The body count was not a measure of enemy capacity being degraded. It was a measure of enemy willingness to continue trading deaths for time, and on that exchange, the North Vietnamese were consistently willing to pay more than the American public was willing to spend. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. The last Americans to leave Saigon left by helicopter from the embassy roof on the morning of April 30th, 1975. The war between North and South Vietnam continued for another month after the American departure, ending when North Vietnamese tanks entered Saigon on April 30th. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was established as a unified country on July 2, 1976. The specific political outcome that American military and political commitment had been devoted to preventing for more than 2 decades was achieved within 2 years of American withdrawal. The classified assessments that had predicted this outcome with varying degrees of confidence over the preceding decade had been produced, filed, and managed. The people who had produced them had moved on. The war had continued after its purpose dissolved, sustained by the momentum of institutions that had organized themselves around its continuation, and it ended when that momentum finally ran out.